welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I would just do a video of every book that I read in 2020. I usually keep a list of the books that I read each year, so I just went off them, collected all the books together, and we're just going to go through them very rapidly, and I'm going to show you everything that I read this year. A lot of it is horror, sci-fi, thriller based novels, but there are definitely some other categories in here as well. Let's get into it. But before we begin, also just know that I do have a horror channel, and my favorite books of 2020, my favorite horror books of 2020 is on that channel. So I'll leave that video linked below if you guys are interested in, out of all of these, which ones were my very favorite for the year. I'm not gonna go in order of the books that I read this year because I just put them in a pile, so we're just gonna go through them. The first book I read this year was Ray Bradbury's The October Country. Absolutely loved this novel. It's a bunch of short stories, and they're about everything from witches to vampires to killer wind. Like, there's a lot of fun, creepy stuff in here. It definitely gets you in the mood for October, and I would highly suggest this for an October read. Fantastic novel. This was one of my favorites of the year. I think I read Coma this year. It wasn't on my list, but I do remember reading it, and I don't think it was last year, so I'm pretty sure it was this year. But I read Robin Cook's Coma. Robin Cook is actually a physician, or no, he's a surgeon, and he also writes fiction. So really interesting story. It's about a girl who finds that there are patients dying at a rapid rate or being put in comas at a rapid rate in her hospital, and she's really the only one that has the courage to dive in and figure out what exactly is going on. And it turns out more people are in on it than she originally thought. It's very interesting the way that it's written because it's very to the point. It's like, and then she walked in the room, and then she grabbed a cup of coffee, and then she wrote down her chart, and then she went to her room, and then she saw a patient. Like how you would think a physician would write a story. So definitely interesting. The cover just really intrigued me, and I thought it was a fun novel. This was another one that I forgot to put on my list, but I know I read it this year, and it's Tales of Ordinary Madness, and this is by Charles Bukowski. So if you are a reader, then you probably either love or hate Bukowski. He's definitely very polarizing. He does definitely write things that are uncomfortable to read and things that I don't obviously agree with, but I did want to give this book a read. I do like his stories and I do like his poetry, and this was just a book of his short stories, and there was just so much going on in here. A lot of it you could tell was kind of based on his own personal experience and was more like nonfiction, but then there were stories that were absolutely fiction. So it was definitely interesting. It gave me a different perspective on Bukowski for sure. And next we have Audition. This is by, I'm sorry for butchering this, Ryu Murakami. And this is actually the book that the movie Audition was based off of. So if you've seen the movie Audition, it started as a novel first. I read this and compared the two on my horror channel. So it is about a man who creates an audition because he's in the movie industry, to hire a female for a role, but really he's just trying to find a new wife. And the person that he ends up finding turns out to be a little crazier than he anticipated. Interesting novel. Definitely not as bloody as the movie. I think the movie was directed by Takashi Miike, I think is how you pronounce his name, and his movies are just like super gross and gory and out there. So definitely has some Takashi in there, but it definitely started here. So it's kind of interesting to see where it started from, and also read a novel from a different culture. This is a Japanese writer, so that was really interesting for me, and I loved that. I also, another book that I compared on my channel, I read Richard Matheson's A Stir of Echoes. Now this is the novel that the movie A Stir of Echoes came from. Again, definitely different than the movie. So I grew up with the movie. The movies, I think it like came out in the 90s. It stars Kevin Bacon. So, I mean, they're kind of the same in that the main character gets hypnotized, and then he can kind of tune into things other than just what we all see and hear. But it's definitely less of a ghost story than the actual movie is. So I was a little disappointed. I know I hate being disappointed in books, especially Richard Matheson, because he's a huge horror icon, you know? He wrote a lot of episodes of the Twilight Zone, and he's just was such an influence. He wrote I Am Legend. He's a big name in horror. So it sucked that I was a little disappointed, but I think just because I loved that film so much growing up that I wasn't expecting the book to be so far from a ghost story. But still, I mean, an interesting read. I think I wish I would have gone into it knowing that it was different from the novel or the film, but still read that guy. I also, another one I compared on my horror channel was Psycho by Robert Bloch. So this of course was the book that the movie Psycho is based off of. There were a lot of similarities in this one, and but a few differences, so you guys can definitely check out that on my other channel to see what the similarities and differences were. I'll leave that video below as well. You know, about Norman Bates, about his mom, about the hotel, I mean, a lot of it was very similar. The next book I read, if you guys are from my horror channel, you know I read this one because I've talked about it 3,000 times this year, The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock. I love this book. This was not the first time I read it. I read it years ago as well, but I reread it this year because I knew that the movie was coming out. So again, for this one, I compared the book and the movie on my other channel, and I think I also had just a whole video dedicated to just the book of this as well. It's about two different towns, Knockemstiff and a different town that I can't remember, and it's really just like the tragedy that goes on, and everyone's just a terrible person and horrible things keep happening, but it's all intertwined and they all come together. It's a really well written story, very gory and intense, pretty intense read, but I absolutely love it. I think Donald Ray Pollock is a literary genius. Next up, I read The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Again, not the first time I read it, but I reread it again so I could compare it to the movie Hellraiser, because Hellraiser is actually based off of this book. Clive Barker wrote this, and then he wrote and directed Hellraiser. It's pretty similar to Hellraiser. You still have the Cenobites, and you still have Frank, and you still have the family, and it's pretty similar, but I think you do get a little bit more when you read this as opposed to just watching the film. I come back to this every year or so to just, it's a super easy read, and it's just fun and awesome, and I love Clive Barker, as you will see later on. Oh, never mind, you'll see it now. Clive Barker, The Damnation Game, another book I read. I just love this. This is like a Faustian story. I love him because his books are very bloody and gory, but then they have very beautiful language, and it's just, they're just fantastic. I love this book so much. I highly recommend this if you guys are into the creepy and gory and bloody. Definitely pick up a copy of this. It's about a man who's getting out of prison, and he gets hired by a very infamous individual, very rich individual, to kind of protect him and be his bodyguard, but he gets in over his head when he starts figuring out what it exactly is that is going on. Next book that I read was Faust. So this is a very old book, and it's, if you don't know the story of Faust, it's about a man who sells his soul to the devil because he's tired of earthly possessions and he just needs more. This one was interesting. It's written in, I think, 2 separate parts, or is it 3? I think it's written in 2 parts. But it's interesting because the first part of this is definitely horror, and it's so interesting and it's really neat. And then the second half is very much so not horror and very different from the first half. And I guess the writer actually wrote those decades apart. And so they do read very differently. You kind of follow Faust's journey after selling his soul, and where he's kind of stuck with Mephistopheles, who's the demon that grants his wish. It's an interesting story, but I would say the second half is not as intense as the first half. Actually, it was made into a story called, or a play, sorry, called The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, that was written by Christopher Marlowe, and that is where my dog Marlowe is named after. Anyways, the next story I read this year was Pebble in the Sky. This is by Isaac Asimov. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. This was my first Isaac Asimov story that I read, and he is like a very prominent science fiction writer. I really enjoyed the first half of it. I will say that I read this at the beginning of last year, the beginning of 2020, and the ending turned out to be about a disease, and it was just definitely a switch from the beginning, and I think I just read it at the wrong time, to be honest. But I am interested to give Isaac's work another go. The next one that I read was Dana Reed's The Summoning. So this is just a fun little story about demons. It's about a kid who accidentally summons demons from a record, or I guess children that actually accidentally summon demons from a record. The kid kind of figures out what's going on because it's this rock band that's actually a bunch of demons, and so he goes and he's trying to figure out how to stop this rock band of demons. And it gets definitely very silly. There are like little demon potatoes that come and kill people. It's really funny. I've never heard of Dana Reed before, but I found it for $3 at my local bookstore, and I just loved the cover. So I picked this guy up, and the ending's actually really dark, and there are aspects of it that are pretty twisted in here. So I did enjoy it. Next, I read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This is by Philip K. Dick, and if you did not know, this is actually the story that the movie Blade Runner is based off of. I've heard that it's more so the second movie movie is more directly related to this than the first. I have watched the second one, but not since reading this, I don't think. So I read this, and I'm definitely going to give this another read and compare it to the movies on my horror channel if you guys are interested in that at all. But a very interesting story, a few similarities, but a lot of differences from the movie Blade Runner. And Blade Runner is just one of my favorite films of all time. So definitely suggest this if you enjoy Blade Runner. It gives you a lot to think about. Next book I read was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. This I think I had read as a kid, an abridged version for children. I don't think I actually read the full version until this year, and I just adored it. It's about a group of scientists and fishermen that go out to try to hunt this sea creature that keeps sinking all these ships. I think it's a whale or a narwhal or something, and the scientist ends up getting onto this animal, which turns out to be a submarine, and he goes aboard and they just go all through the oceans, and Captain Nemo, Captain Nobody, runs the ship, and he's just a very interesting, weird guy, and things kind of go wrong. It's a really cool adventure story. Another one that I read was The Fall by Albert Camus, I think is how you pronounce his name. I'm sorry, I'm an idiot. This one was very interesting. It was very much so stream of consciousness type book, so it made it a little bit hard to fully be engulfed in the story. So for example, instead of like, Jeff said, can I have that? And Sam was like, sure. It's like, Jeff asked me, can I have that? And I was like, sure. And then I sat down next to him, and then Jeff picked up a pen, and then Jeff wrote me a letter. It was very stream of consciousness. So a little bit more challenging to get to, but I do love his writing, and one of his stories, The Stranger, is like one of my favorite stories. So I will give this another read once I'm ready for it, because I think that there's a lot in here that I missed just from, where is this going? I also read I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. I did a video comparing this versus the movie on my horror channel as well. This one is not so much like I Am Legend, but it is like the movie The Last Man on Earth, which is also based off of this book. It stars Vincent Price, which is right here. I love Vincent Price, he's awesome. Very much so like The Last Man on Earth, very different from I Am Legend, but definitely worth a read. Another book I read this year, oh guys, Harvest, The True Story of Alien Abduction. This is by J.L. Davies, and I actually read another book by him as well called Haunted Horror of Haverford West. So that one is about ghosts, and this one is about aliens. They are both true stories and terrifying reads. Highly suggest these guys. Next, I read Stories from the Twilight Zone by Rod Serling. So if you, for some reason, don't know, Rod Serling is the host of the Twilight Zone, but he also wrote most of the stories. And this is just a book that has, I think, 5 or 6 stories from the Twilight Zone. It's unclear whether he wrote the Twilight Zone and then wrote these stories, or wrote these stories and then adapted them to the Twilight Zone. I'm not really sure. However, really cool to read. Really cool to just see it in a different medium. I loved this. I thought it was fantastic. I'm obsessed with Rod Serling, so highly suggest this for any Twilight Zone fans. Next, Entropy in Bloom. This is by Jeremy Robert Johnson. This is a book of short stories, and if you didn't know, I write my own short stories as well. They're always linked below. And so I love reading other people's short stories, and there aren't just a whole lot nowadays, or a lot that I've been introduced to nowadays. So my friend actually bought this for me, and I loved it so much. There are some like very intense, bloody, gory stories. Then there are also some very calm, heartbreaking stories. It's a whole spectrum of stories. So if you enjoy short stories and you don't mind a little bit of blood and guts, then this one's a good one to pick up. Next one I read, Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle. Where do I even begin with this? It's about, can I even explain this book? I don't even know. I feel like I was on acid reading this. Okay, so this is about a man who's writing a book about the man who made the H-bomb. And so he died, but he's trying to track down his family, his children, to get more information. So he goes on this whole ride, and he finds out that the man who made the H-bomb also made a substance called, oh no, what was it called? It's like an isotope. It turns water into ice, I think. And so he goes on this whole journey, and he goes to this island where this Buchanan religion is there, but people don't believe that it's real, but they do believe that it's real, but they just say that it's not real. It's seriously such a weird, confusing whirlwind, but I love Kurt Vonnegut, and he wrote the book Slaughterhouse-Five, which is one of my favorite novels. This was a weird one for sure, and I think that I missed a lot in it because I was just like, what is happening? I definitely have to go back and read it, but very strange because I read this one right after I read Adjustment Day by Chuck Palahniuk, and they have very similar, I mean, they're very different books, but they do have very similar like religions that aren't real religions that people read and follow, but they aren't really real, but then they kind of are. So very weird that I read these next to each other. So I do kind of wonder if this book influenced this one a little bit. But the Palahniuk book was about separating white people from gay people. I don't know. I didn't love this one, unfortunately. Next one I read was The Woman in Cabin 10. This is by Ruth Ware. It's about a woman who gets invited onto a cruise ship and with a lot of like influential people in society. She thinks a murder has happened and she's the only one that dares to figure out what actually went on. Really enjoyed this book. So this is a novella, and same with obviously The Hellbound Heart. That was a novella too. But I read H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man. I don't think I need to explain what that one was about. But I also had a few other ones that I don't have. I also read Macbeth by William Shakespeare. I lost it. I have no idea where Macbeth went, but that's a really interesting story about a man who's just trying to become king and kind of take over, and he kind of gets what he deserves at the end. I read Who Goes There. This is by John W. Campbell, so this one was an ebook. And this is actually what the movie The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, is based off of. So this I talked about on my horror channel as well. A lot of similarities, but a few differences in that one. I also read The Birds by Daphne. This again is a novella that the movie The Birds is based off of. Definitely different than the movie. I think what I read was that it had to do more with war. It was like a metaphor for war than like an actual horror story. That I talked about on my channel too if you're interested in that. I also read Herbert West Reanimator by H.P. Lovecraft. In fact, I read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stories and novellas this year, but I didn't incorporate them all. But I read a lot. I also read The Color Out of Space. And then the last thing I read was Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. And this is a story about a bunch of horror writers that go and stay in a haunted hotel, and you kind of expect things to, you know, happen there. It gets all creepy, and then they all go home and you're like, wait, what? And then things start revving up again. It's really interesting. Different kind of take on a haunted house story. But that is it. Those are the books and novellas that I read this year. Most of them. I know a few I forgot to write down, and I didn't write down every short story that I read. But for the most part, those are the books that I read in 2020. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to subscribe to my horror channel if you guys are interested at all in any of these books. I like doing movie versus book comparisons with horror films. Otherwise, I will see you again next Friday. I'll catch you again next week. Bye, guys.